My name is Rachel Holt, and I am 37 years old. For 11 months, my husband and I attended couples therapy together, twice a month, with a therapist named Dr. in Caldwell, to address what my husband described as communication difficulties that had been building between us for the preceding 2 years. 6 weeks ago, Dr. Caldwell left her office briefly during one of our sessions to retrieve a file from the adjacent room. Her notepad remained on the table between us. I did not intend to read it. I was not looking for anything. I was simply sitting in a therapy room waiting for our therapist to return, when my eyes landed on a single line of handwriting at the top of the most recent page. The line read, "Marcus aware of relationship with Diane, denies to our session goal manage disclosure." Before I tell you what I did in the next 3 minutes before Dr. Caldwell returned, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to the beginning of the 11 months that led to that waiting room and that notepad. Marcus and I had been married for 8 years when he first suggested couples therapy, framing it, as I mentioned, around communication difficulties that had been building for some time. A framing I accepted, genuinely, as a reasonable characterization of certain tensions that had, in fact, been present in our marriage for the preceding year or so. I want to be honest that I had, during the period before therapy began, noticed certain changes in Marcus's behavior that I had attributed at the time to work stress and to the general strain of a marriage, navigating a difficult, busy period in both our lives. Slightly more guarded communication, somewhat less spontaneous warmth, the particular preoccupation that sometimes settles over someone managing something they are not yet ready to discuss directly. I had asked Marcus directly, on 2 separate occasions during this period, whether something specific was bothering him beyond general work and life stress. Both times he had told me, genuinely and convincingly, that he was simply tired, that the preceding year had been professionally demanding, and that he genuinely believed couples therapy would help us both communicate more effectively during a period that had simply accumulated more tension than either of us had adequately addressed. I agreed to therapy in good faith, entering our first session with Dr. Caldwell with genuine openness and genuine willingness to examine whatever aspects of our own communication and relationship dynamics the process might surface. Dr. Caldwell, during those early sessions, struck me as genuinely skilled and genuinely present, asking perceptive questions, creating a space that felt, throughout the early months, like it was actually moving us towards something more honest and more connected than the preceding year of accumulated tension had allowed for. I want to be specific about something I noticed periodically throughout these sessions without fully articulating it to myself as concerning at the time. There were occasional moments when Dr. Caldwell seemed to be navigating Marcus's responses with a particular care, a slight, almost imperceptible steering quality to certain follow-up questions that, in retrospect, seemed less like neutral, therapeutic inquiry and more like careful management of how far a particular line of discussion was going to go during a given session. I noticed this quality without ever quite naming it to myself as suspicious, attributing it instead simply to skilled therapeutic management of a process that, by its nature, required careful pacing and sequencing. Diane was Marcus's colleague at the financial consulting firm where he had worked for the preceding 6 years, a woman I had met perhaps 4 or 5 times across various work events throughout that period, always briefly, always in the context of large group gatherings where sustained individual conversation was neither expected nor particularly notable. I had no specific suspicion regarding Diane during most of our therapy period. She was simply a name that appeared occasionally in Marcus's work-related conversation, no more or less frequently than various other colleagues whose names circulated through the ordinary texture of discussing one's professional life. I want to be honest that there had been a single, brief, easily dismissed moment of vague unease regarding Diane, roughly 14 months before the notepad incident, when I had noticed her name appearing in a text notification on Marcus's phone during a shared meal. A notification he had responded to relatively quickly before setting the phone face down without mentioning what the message had been about. I had not pursued this moment at the time, recognizing it as easily explainable through entirely ordinary professional communication. and not wishing to introduce suspicion into what I genuinely believed was an otherwise functional marriage. The notepad incident occurred during our 22nd therapy session, 11 months into the process, during what had been, up to the moment Dr. Caldwell left the room, an apparently routine session exploring certain patterns in how Marcus and I each responded to perceived emotional distance in the relationship. Dr. Caldwell left briefly, explaining she needed to retrieve a document from the adjacent room. A momentary interruption that created perhaps 3 minutes of silence between Marcus and me in the therapy room. I want to be specific about my own state in those 3 minutes, because I think it matters to understanding how completely unprepared I was for what I inadvertently saw. I was not scanning the room for anything. I was not in a heightened state of suspicion. I was simply waiting, looking around the familiar room somewhat absently, when my eyes landed on Dr. Caldwell's notepad, positioned on the small table between the two facing chairs, where she and I typically sat. The notepad was positioned at an angle where the top portion of the most recent page was clearly visible without any deliberate effort to read it, and the single line at the top of that page was written in Dr. Caldwell's distinctive, clear handwriting, legible from where I sat without requiring me to lean forward or make any purposeful attempt to read her notes. Marcus, aware of relationship with Diane, denies to our session goal managed disclosure. I read this line once, then I read it again. I want to be specific about what this single line actually communicated to me. Reading it in those 3 minutes before Dr. Caldwell returned, it communicated clearly that Marcus was aware of some relationship involving a woman named Diane, that he was actively denying this awareness to me, designated simply as R in the notation, and that Dr. Caldwell's explicit goal for our session involved something she had written as managed disclosure, a phrase that, to my reading, suggested she was actively planning how to pace or control the process of me eventually learning something she already knew. In the 3 minutes before Dr. Caldwell returned, I did 3 things. I took a photograph of the notepad with my phone, moving quickly and quietly, the phone already in my hand from having been checking a message when she left. I replaced the phone in my pocket and returned my posture to exactly what it had been when she left the room, and I decided, in those same 3 minutes, that I was not going to indicate, through any visible change in my expression or behavior, that anything had changed between the moment she left and the moment she returned. Dr. Caldwell returned, placed the document she had retrieved on her desk, and resumed the session with what I now understood, having read that single line, was a particular, careful steering quality I had noticed before, but never quite named. I participated in the remainder of the session with what I believe was sufficient composure to avoid indicating that anything had shifted in my understanding of what was actually occurring in that room, though I want to be honest that maintaining this composure across the remaining 40 minutes of the session represented the most genuinely difficult acting I have ever been asked to perform in any context. I needed Marcus to remain unaware, leaving that session, that anything had changed, specifically, to preserve whatever independence of action I might still have available to me, before whatever managed disclosure Dr. Caldwell had apparently been planning eventually occurred on her own timetable, rather than mine. I drove home from that session without speaking, which Marcus attributed to simple tiredness following an emotionally demanding therapy discussion, a plausible explanation that he apparently accepted without particular concern. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after Marcus went inside, looking at the photograph on my phone, rereading the line I had memorized during those 3 minutes in the therapy room. The following morning, while Marcus was at work, I reviewed, for the first time, with genuine, deliberate attention, his phone records, email accounts, and various messaging applications, using access I had to certain shared accounts and devices, specifically, looking for any communication pattern involving Diane Ferris that might illuminate what that single notepad line had described as a relationship. What I found, over the following several hours, did not require sophisticated interpretation or ambiguous inference. It was direct, extensive, and had clearly been ongoing for a period considerably longer than any single notable incident might have suggested. I want to walk through, specifically, what the communication records revealed, though I will describe this with appropriate restraint, given its personal nature. The records established clearly that Marcus and Diane had maintained a sustained, intimate relationship, both emotional and physical, for approximately 22 months at the time I discovered this evidence, a period that encompassed almost the entire duration of our couple's therapy process and extended roughly 11 months prior to therapy's start. I want to be specifically clear about what this timeline meant regarding the therapy itself. Marcus had proposed couples therapy approximately 1 month after this relationship had already begun, a timing that, considering what I now understood about Dr. Caldwell's notepad notation, raised questions I needed to address directly before doing anything else. I called Dr. Caldwell's office the following morning and requested an individual session, explaining only that I needed to speak with her independently regarding some personal concerns that had arisen for me. Following our most recent joint session, she scheduled an individual appointment for 3 days later, a brief window during which I spent considerable time consulting an attorney who specialized in both family law and, specifically, professional ethics complaints. Wanting to fully understand my position and my options before any direct confrontation occurred, I walked into my individual session with Dr. Caldwell carrying a printed copy of the photograph I had taken of her notepad, alongside a printed summary of the communication records I had reviewed. Organized chronologically, I placed both documents on the table between us. Before she had finished settling into her chair, I told her, directly, that I had read her notepad during the 3 minutes she was out of the room 3 days earlier, and that I had subsequently reviewed available communication records that confirmed what her notation had described. I told her I needed her to explain, specifically, what managed disclosure meant in the context of her session notes, and when, exactly, she had intended this disclosure to occur on whatever timeline she had apparently been managing. Dr. Caldwell's composure shifted, visibly, in a way I had never seen during 11 months of sessions where I had always been, by definition, on the other side of whatever professional composure she maintained. She told me eventually that Marcus had disclosed the relationship to her during an individual session she had conducted with him separately, approximately 4 months into our joint therapy process, a disclosure she had determined, using professional judgment, to introduce gradually into our joint sessions, rather than immediately, believing a managed, paced approach would produce better outcomes than immediate disclosure. I want to address this explanation directly, because I think understanding what it actually meant matters considerably to understanding everything that followed. Dr. Caldwell had known, for approximately 7 months at the time of the notepad incident, that my husband was conducting an active affair, and had continued facilitating our joint therapy sessions throughout that entire period, conducting sessions specifically aimed at improving our communication and emotional connection, while managing, on her own professional timeline, when and how I would eventually be allowed to know the truth about what was actually occurring in my own marriage. I told her, clearly, that I intended to file a formal ethics complaint with the relevant professional licensing board, and that I would be terminating our therapeutic relationship immediately. Effective that session, she did not attempt to dissuade me. I think, based on her expression when I placed the photograph of her notepad on the table, she had understood immediately that whatever managed disclosure process she had been planning had already been entirely superseded by events. The following weeks involved several significant, simultaneous processes that I want to describe in appropriate sequence. I confronted Marcus directly the evening after my individual session with Dr. Caldwell, presenting the communication records I had reviewed and telling him clearly that I was already aware of the full scope of what I was now asking him to confirm, rather than inviting any version of selective, minimizing disclosure. His response, once he understood I was not asking whether something had occurred, but simply asking him to confirm what I already knew, was considerably more direct than I might have anticipated, acknowledging the relationship with Diane clearly and acknowledging, additionally, that he had disclosed this to Dr. Caldwell during their individual session, and had agreed to her suggested approach regarding gradual, managed disclosure during our joint sessions. I filed a formal ethics complaint against Dr. Caldwell with the state licensing board approximately 2 weeks after my individual session with her, documenting both the specific content of her notepad notation and the 7-month period during which she had continued our joint therapeutic process while possessing direct knowledge of my Husband's active deception, the complaint process, which I will not detail exhaustively here, resulted, approximately 5 months later, in a formal finding that Dr. Caldwell had violated specific professional ethics standards regarding informed consent and the duty of candor to clients in therapeutic relationships. A finding that resulted in a formal censure and a mandatory supervised practice period during which she was required to practice under oversight. Marcus and I have not reconciled. I want to be clear about this, recognizing that some people, hearing this story, might wonder whether eventual reconciliation represented a possible or hoped-for outcome. It did not. Whatever the relationship between Marcus and me might have been capable of surviving, I found that the specific combination of the sustained deception, the active, ongoing nature of the relationship throughout our therapy period, and the particular layer of additional betrayal represented by what Dr. Caldwell had been managing, together created a situation I was not able to find a genuine, honest path through toward continued marriage. I am not sharing this to suggest reconciliation is never possible or never right following similar circumstances. I am sharing it because honesty about my own specific outcome feels more important than any alternative framing. The divorce was finalized approximately 8 months after the notepad incident, a process that, combined with the ethics complaint process, represented the most demanding 18 months of my adult life. Navigated simultaneously with the specific grief of a marriage's ending and the particular additional layer of grief represented by the loss of a therapeutic relationship that had, I now understood, never been what I had believed it to be. I am in therapy now, with a different therapist, someone I chose with considerably more care and considerably more awareness of what questions to ask and what considerations matter when entrusting someone with the specific access that a therapeutic relationship requires. I think often about that 3-minute window in the therapy room, about how entirely accidental my reading of that notepad actually was, how completely unprepared I was for what it contained, how differently everything might have proceeded had Dr. Caldwell not happened to leave the room at that particular moment, during that particular session. I think, too, about what managed disclosure actually meant in that specific context, about what it would have felt like to eventually receive, on a timeline and through a process designed and controlled by a therapist I trusted and a husband I was trying to repair my relationship with, information that both of them had been managing together for 7 months. Regarding my own marriage, I think about that regularly. I think it tells you something important about the specific value of accidentally reading a line of handwriting that was never intended for you. That is my story. If you have ever accidentally discovered something that changed everything, through no deliberate effort of your own, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, and if this story reminded you that the people entrusted with the most access to our trust carry the heaviest responsibility not to misuse it, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.